Welcome to Weather and War, where we explore the fascinating ways weather has shaped military history. I'm meteorologist Mark. Today we're traveling back more than 700 years to a moment when the most powerful empire on Earth seemed unstoppable. Imagine standing on the coast of Japan in the year 1281. Far out on the horizon, thousands of ships appear. They stretch farther than the eye can see. A massive invasion force is coming. Perhaps 140,000 soldiers, warriors from all across the Mongol Empire. It's the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen. The samurai wait anxiously along the shore. The outcome seems inevitable. And then the sky begins to darken, the wind starts to rise, the sea grows violent, and nature changes history. This is the story of the divine wind, the storms that may have saved Japan from conquest and gave the world the word kamikaze. Before we can understand the storms, we need to understand the enemy. The Mongols were the superpower of the 13th century. Their rise began with one of history's most famous conquerors, Genghis Khan. Under his leadership and that of his descendants, the Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Their army swept across Asia. They crushed kingdoms. They defeated empires. They advanced into Eastern Europe. In many places, resistance was simply overwhelmed. One historian summarized it this way, quote, "Almost every army that faced the Mongols lost," unquote. This gave the Mongols a sense of invincibility, and rightly so. By the late 1200s, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan ruled China and much of East Asia. There was one nearby nation that refused to submit. One nation that prevented the Mongols from having total dominance over East Asia. Japan. Kublai Khan demanded tribute. They wanted some type of payment in exchange for peace. Japan refused. He sent more demands. Japan refused again. Eventually, diplomacy gave way to military planning, and the largest invasion fleet in East Asian history began taking shape. Now, the first invasion, taking place in 1274, is known as the Brunei invasion, and it came in November of 1274. Historians estimate the fleet consisted of roughly 800 to 900 ships, and they estimate 30 to 40,000 Mongols in this first invasion. The invading force sailed from Korea toward Japan. Their target was Hakata Bay on the island of Kyushu. When the Mongols landed, the Japanese quickly realized they were facing a very different style of warfare. Samurai combat traditionally emphasized individual valor. Warriors often announced their names and sought personal duels. The Mongols had little interest in such traditions. They fought as coordinated units. They used massed archery, which is that form of archery where large groups of warriors would release their arrows simultaneously at the same time. They employed tactics refined through decades of conquest. They even used explosive weapons known as thunder crash bombs, which are basically cast iron shells filled with gunpowder. The Japanese defenders were under immense pressure. At first, the invasion appeared to be succeeding. Then, weather entered the battle. A powerful storm struck the area. Winds battered ships, waves tossed vessels against one another. Many ships were damaged or destroyed. The Mongol fleet withdrew. Now, historians still debate exactly how decisive the storm was, Some believe the Mongols may have already been preparing to retreat. Others argue the weather transformed an orderly withdrawal into a catastrophe. Whatever the case, the invasion failed. Japan had survived. For now. Now, to understand what this storm was, which was a typhoon, we have to understand a little bit about how they develop and how they're even named. And as you can see here, a hurricane and a typhoon are the same storm. They're just named differently based on what part of the world they occur in. Now, if a storm occurs in the Pacific Ocean on the eastern side of the international date line, all the way across the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic Ocean, those are referred to as hurricanes. If the same type of storm develops west of the international date line and closer to Asia, we call those typhoons. It's simply a naming convention. Both types of storms occur from warm, humid ocean water rising up into a much colder atmosphere above. That warm air cools, condenses, forms clouds. Under the right conditions, it will form thunderstorms. And those thunderstorms can even turn into complexes of thunderstorms that may even access the spin of the earth as a little bit of a rotational force and begin to spin and form an area of low pressure. And if conditions remain favorable, they can evolve into the most powerful storms on Earth, hurricanes. Or, if you're closer to Asia, a typhoon. Now, these storms have tracks that they tend to take in different months of the year, with July, August, September, and October being the time when Japan is most at risk for a typhoon. With June, November, and December having tracks that normally take these storms south of Japan. But keep in mind, this first invasion was in November, and so that storm was a little off track for the time of year, but nonetheless quite impactful. So back to this attack. The Japanese leadership understood something important because they are smart. The Mongols will be back. No empire as powerful as the Mongols would simply accept defeat. So the Japanese prepared. Defensive walls were built around Hakata Bay, samurai forces were strengthened, coastal defenses were improved, and tensions continued to rise. Adding fuel to the conflict, Japan executed Mongol envoys on 2 separate occasions. That's right, Mongols sent envoys of folks to talk to the Japanese, and on both occasions, those envoys were murdered. Needless to say, the possibility of peace disappeared. Everyone knew another invasion was coming. The only question remaining was when. So for years, Japan watched the sea, waiting, preparing. One historian described it perfectly. Quote, Japan became a nation waiting for the horizon. Unquote. The answer finally arrives 7 years later in 1281. When it became clear that the attack was imminent, the Japanese government issued a nationwide call to prayer. They'd done everything else. Now all that was left to do was pray. And the second invasion dwarfed the first. Known as the Kwan invasion, some estimates suggest more than 4,000 ships participated. Now keep in mind, up to 900 ships participated in the first attack. Troop numbers may have approached 140,000 men. And again, keep in mind, there were 40,000 in that first attack. For perspective, some historians estimate this force was even larger than the Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day in 1944. However, there were 160,000 forces involved on D-Day, so D-Day is likely still yet the largest in history. Think about that for a moment. 7 centuries before D-Day, A massive multinational armada gathered to invade Japan. The Japanese defenses performed better this time. The walls around Hakata Bay prevented easy landings. Samurai launched nighttime raids against anchored ships. The Mongols struggled to establish secure positions ashore. Days turned into weeks. Much of the fleet remained anchored offshore while commanders searched for a path forward. And that delay would prove disastrous, because while armies were preparing for battle, the atmosphere was preparing something else. Then came the storm. Again, a typhoon sweeps across the region. Accounts from the period describe chaos. Powerful winds hammered the fleet. Ships collided in darkness. Anchors failed. Masts snapped. Men were thrown into the sea. Horses disappeared beneath towering waves. The ocean became a battlefield. But unlike previous battles, there was no strategy, no formation, no military genius, only survival. When the storm finally ended, much of the invasion fleet had been destroyed. Tens of thousands were dead. The invasion was over, and Japan had survived again. The Japanese believed divine forces had intervened, and one could argue rightly so. They gave the storm a name: Kamikaze. The word combines two Japanese terms, kami meaning spirit or god, and kaze meaning wind. Together, the divine wind. Centuries later, during World War II, Japan would invoke the same symbol again. Suicide pilots became known as kamikaze pilots because they were viewed as protectors of Japan, modern embodiments of the divine wind that had once saved the nation. Approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots flew missions during World War II, killing roughly 7,000 Allied personnel. The symbolism reached across nearly 7 centuries of Japanese history. As a meteorologist, this is where the story becomes especially fascinating. What if those typhoons had never occurred? Would Japan have fallen? Would Japanese history have unfolded completely differently? Would the balance of power across Asia have been forever changed? We'll never know. But it's remarkable how often weather influences events in ways that military planners cannot control. Typhoons develop over warm ocean waters. The Western Pacific is one of the most active tropical cyclone regions on Earth. The atmosphere doesn't care about military objectives. It doesn't recognize emperors. It doesn't negotiate treaties. It simply follows the laws of nature set forth by God. And sometimes those laws change history. Empires prepare for armies. Few prepare for the atmosphere. The Mongols conquered vast portions of the known world. They defeated kingdoms from China to Eastern Europe. They built one of history's greatest empires. Yet twice, on the shores of Japan, they encountered an enemy they could not defeat. Not the samurai, not fortifications, not superior weaponry, the weather. The story of the divine wind reminds us that history is not shaped only by kings and generals and armies. Sometimes it's shaped by clouds, wind, waves, and storms. Sometimes the atmosphere gets the final vote. The Mongols conquered kingdoms from China to Europe, but twice on the shores of Japan, they faced an enemy no army could defeat: the weather. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Meteorologist Mark with Weather and War.